Nicodemus, Part 1. Nicodemus, a Pharisee and ruler, came by night to Christ, and the state of obscurity in which he was is shown in the conversation which follows, given in the Gospel of John, chapter 3, verses 2 to 10. Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these miracles which you are doing unless God is with him. In very truth, I tell you, answered Jesus, that unless a man is born anew, he cannot see the kingdom of God. How is it possible, Nicodemus asked, for a man to be born when he is old? Can he a second time enter his mother's womb and be born? In very truth, I tell you, replied Jesus, that unless a man is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. Whatever is born of the flesh is flesh, and whatever is born of the Spirit is spirit. Do not be astonished at my telling you. You must all be born anew. The wind blows where it chooses, and you hear its sound, but you do not know where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit. How is all this possible? Asked Nicodemus. Are you, replied Jesus, the teacher of Israel, and yet you do not understand these things? There is something strange in the sequence of these words, especially at the beginning. What does Nicodemus mean, and what does Christ mean? Nicodemus has not asked a question, yet Christ is said to answer him. What is he answering? It is not obvious at first sight that anything needs to be answered in the preliminary words which are put into the mouth of Nicodemus. In this narrative of a supposed conversation at night between the Pharisee and Christ, Nicodemus is shown as saying, earnestly and without any intention of flattery, that he has seen the miracles done by Christ, and is therefore convinced that Christ is a teacher come from God. We know, he says, that you are a teacher come from God, because no one can do these miracles which you are doing unless God is with him. This seems a reasonable statement requiring no answer, and one that is going to lead on to some actual question, or perhaps a confession, or a request for advice. But it is just at this point that Christ is described as interrupting him by an answer. What was the reason of this interruption, and what was there in the preliminary words of Nicodemus that it was necessary to answer? It might be supposed that Christ would have agreed with Nicodemus and have said to him, in so many words, that he was quite right in his conclusion, and that the miracles were convincing evidence that he was a teacher come from God. But, instead, Christ says something that is apparently irrelevant, and it is this apparently irrelevant and uncalled for answer that gives the passage a strange quality, as if it were out of focus, as if two entirely differing meanings were forced together. And it is just in this fact that the significance of the passage lies. The standpoint of Nicodemus and the standpoint of Christ are brought into open collision at the outset in two briefly formulated sentences, in order to show the extraordinary difference between them, and, like everything else in the Gospels, the passage is in the nature of a test for the understanding of whoever reads it. In the two opening verses of the conversation, the words follow one another smoothly, but the meanings involved in them are contrary. And this fact is brought out into greater clearness subsequently in the rest of the passage, when Nicodemus is shown as not understanding anything at all of what Christ is speaking about. What is the standpoint of Nicodemus? It is a standpoint which has its origin in the senses. Nicodemus begins from what he has seen with his physical eyes, and presumably he wishes to build up his belief in Christ's teaching from this starting point. He has seen miracles done and signs wrought, and this evidence of the senses decides his belief in Christ. He does not start from anything he has seen internally, but from what he has seen externally. Christ corrects him. Nicodemus had not even yet asked a question, but he had begun to talk in a certain entirely wrong way, and this is what is taken up by Christ. Christ does not directly say that Nicodemus is quite wrong in his approach, but implies it by his answer. He does not actually say to Nicodemus that it is useless beginning with visible proofs of God, but implies that the whole question is one that concerns man. He says, "In very truth I tell you, that unless a man is born anew, he cannot see God." That is, Christ says to Nicodemus that only a new man, another kind of man, can know anything about God. But Nicodemus, searching for outer evidence of God's manifestations and impressed by the miracles, cannot take in what is meant. He thinks that the whole question is to find a visible outside proof that God exists, or is manifested in this or that person. And he wishes quite earnestly to start from such seen and so outer evidence. So, having seen the miracles, he felt that Christ must at least be a remarkable person, and in fact a divine man. Everyone naturally tends to think like this and start from this point and regard the evidence of the seen as final proof, because the mind is first developed by contact with objects of sense, and so is based naturally on the seen world. Nicodemus's faith starts from the central, and so from what is outside, and Christ shows here that this is impossible. Whatever is of the senses and verifiable by them is not the right starting point. If man is capable of undergoing an inner development, an individual transformation, here technically called rebirth, it is clear from what Christ implies that it cannot begin from the evidence of the seen, and so can have no starting point in life. So that whatever we may imagine about the meaning of rebirth, it is obvious that we can already understand one thing, that it can only begin with something internal, something seen within a man, something understood and realized internally, and cannot begin from the worship of anything outside a man, or from any conviction reached by external evidence, such as miracles, or by anything belonging to external life, or, in short, anything coming from outside through the channels of the 5 external senses. Part 2. How is it possible, Nicodemus asked, for a man to be born when he is old? Can he a second time enter his mother's womb and be born? The idea of rebirth is taken literally in terms of sense by Nicodemus. To be born again must mean, to his mind, to be born physically again, to enter physically again the womb of one's own mother, and once more find oneself on the earth, starting life afresh as an infant. But this idea, the idea of starting afresh, of being actually born physically again in this sense from the same mother, is an idea that exists historically in the thought of humanity. The repetition of the same life, the idea that everything repeats itself, that time is curved and so a circle coming back to the same point, where everything recurs again, just as it was before, has existed as a definite idea, and has been referred to in the past by many ancient writers and believed in by many people. This is not the same idea as reincarnation. Time as a circle, that is, time as bringing back the past and restoring everything once more, in fact the idea of the recurrence of all things, is a very old idea, going back to the beginning of our Western culture, and in fact probably going back to Pythagoras, and one that has been revived at different times and sometimes brought forward as one explanation of life and of people's actions, differences, talents and destinies. This idea that Nicodemus seems to touch, or at least seems to be made to touch by John, based on the recurrence of all things, accounts for many things in life that are otherwise difficult to account for. A man may remember his life, the life he has lived before and is now living again, or he may remember nothing. But if he remembers, he knows beforehand, that is, he senses what is going to happen, because it has happened before, and there remains in him some dim feeling, some vague sense of the future. Or he finds that very early in life he seems to be more ready, more interested, more able to grasp and understand certain sides of life that seem familiar, or to realize what he wants to do, so that sometimes he may develop very early as a musician, a writer, an artist, or a man of destiny, as it is called, or perhaps merely as a man who feels something deeply, but does not know or has forgotten what to do. Or he may remember only what not to do. In this literal sense, a man, or rather all men, may be born again, physically from the same mother, and once more find themselves in the same time, in the same events, in the same historical period. And if a man remembers something through former suffering, or through some awkward interest, he will know more of some aspect of his time than others, and, without directly knowing, he will feel what he has to do, and to what course he must devote himself and what he must avoid. And he may even know how to act in some emergency, because it all happened before. From this point of view, all events, all wars, all the incidents belonging to a particular time have happened again and again, and are always happening in time itself. The knowledge which comes from a memory of having done all this before, strange, vague, and probably always indirect, the memory that all this has happened before, and that certain things must inevitably happen once more, will make a man feel that he is not placed in life as others are, who remember nothing, but that there is something different in him, something authoritative that he must respond to, whether it leads him to success or failure. And such a man will not believe that a single life explains him, or others, or that everyone begins life at birth. In this sense, that is, in the sense of the physical, literal recurrence of all things, a man will certainly again enter his own mother's womb. And in this sense, if death means that everyone returns at once to the moment of his birth and is again born, literally at the same time as he has always been born, the same year, the same day, and the same hour, then a man can be said to enter again, when he is old, into his mother's womb, and once more be born into the same life as a baby. And even if he remembers nothing, he will do, and be able to do more easily, what he did before, whether good or bad. And if he feels things before they come, the knowledge of the future will really be a knowledge of the past, of what he has lived in and experienced before, because if time is curved and forms a circle, then there is no real past or future, since everything will turn in its own circle of time, and the events of the past will always return, and so become the future, and the events of the future will always be what has already been, and so the past. So past and future will be relative terms according to one's position in the circle of one's own life, that is, the shifting moment we call the present, which we can never catch, never really live in, never really see, save through our senses, which give us only the present moment. As if perhaps we were looking through a slit at a vast inconceivable world standing in an eternal present, in all the dimensions of time, in which all we call past, present, and future is simultaneous in existence, and seeing it only in a brief way, as a section, a slice, as a world limited to 3 dimensions, moving under the power of an ungraspable, mysterious engine, called time, which always silently hurries us on, whether asleep or awake, from everything we had, and from everything we felt or thought, forcing us to live our lives and reach the moment of death. The remark of Nicodemus, "Can a man enter a second time into his mother's womb?" may not therefore have been given in John's account without intention. The idea of literal recurrence may have been introduced here purposely. The Gospels were not written from the point of view of what actually in a narrow historical sense occurred. Everything in the Gospels was written in order to convey meaning or illustrate meaning. The important thing, whether it is a question of parable, incident, or conversation, is to grasp what is meant. The Gospels are only secondarily historical as regards the truth. Primarily they convey truth of another order. Whether the conversation between Christ and Nicodemus by night actually took place is unimportant, because the importance of everything mentioned in the Gospels lies not in historical truth, but in meaning. That is to say, an incident which may or may not have happened was used to bring forward some psychological aspect and indicate some meaning in relation to the main teaching given by Christ. So, in a certain sense, the Gospels are invented and the incidents are grouped in such a way as to convey meaning rather than to record literal historical truth. Nicodemus did not necessarily speak as he did. He may not even have met Christ. Obviously, he is used by John as a type of man in superficial touch with Christ's teachings to show how such a type reacts to it. The Gospels are very concentrated meaning, outwardly clothed in incident and event, where actual parable is not used. And all the teaching is given in a high form of paradox because it was a teaching not easily understood and not possible to give in direct form. Another language was necessary to convey the ideas of which Christ spoke, a language which ordinary mankind, that is, people as we are, cannot take in, and so parable, incident, and illustration were used as a medium. Nicodemus appears in the Gospels as a man who can only understand Christ's teaching in a literal way, and he is also a man who certainly believed that an earthly kingdom of heaven was coming, in which a real physical king would reign, and probably kill off everyone who did not agree with what Nicodemus felt was right. It is so obvious that Christ is trying to take Nicodemus off the level of physical interpretation and explain to him that man as he is, with all his prejudices and dislikes and all the illusions of the senses, is not a person who can see God, and that he must first of all undergo a process called rebirth before he can even begin to believe he knows or understands anything of God's will. Another level of being is necessary before anything is possible in regard to speech of God. So Christ says to Nicodemus, unless a man is born anew, that is, unless he is born as a new man and becomes actually another kind of man, he cannot see God, that is, he cannot even imagine what God is. But people wish to realize God on their own level of being, and may believe they can talk of God and God's will, and people preach and write about God's will as if they know exactly what God's will means, without even troubling themselves with the meaning of the Lord's Prayer. May thy will be done on earth. They imagine not only that God's will is done on earth, and that if their friends suffer misfortune, it signifies that God's will is being done towards them as a punishment, but they suppose that they know about God and what God wishes, and listen to sermons about God's wishes, and even feel superior towards all those who do not act in a religious way, according to their ideas, or go to the same churches. This is the usual situation in life of that thing called religion. But Christ taught no religion. He taught rebirth, and the whole meaning of the Gospels is metanoia and rebirth. But because no one understands that there is anything so specific and real behind what Christ taught, and because everything Christ clearly and specifically taught was turned into religion, the whole meaning of his teaching was changed into something else, something that was merely a matter of argument, of division, of sectarianism, and so of eventual violent and bloody persecutions and horrible wars. All this was due to not understanding the teaching of Christ. It was inevitable because what Christ taught and what meanings lie hidden in the gospel narrative are beyond mankind, because he spoke of a higher level of man, of a development of man beyond the level he is at, whatever sort of man he is or believes that he is. Part 3. What does it mean that a man must be born anew? How can a man in this life, surrounded by all the overpowering phenomena, all the changing events of the external world, be born anew and become a new man, another kind of man, a different man? A man, Christ says to Nicodemus, is born of flesh and water as he is, and to become a different man, a man born anew, he must be born of water and spirit. And elsewhere in the New Testament it is shown that a man must die to himself as he is before he can be born anew. That is, he must die to the flesh before he is born of the Spirit. But these words, which have so often been listened to by hundreds and thousands of people, so easily become merely words and give only the satisfaction of familiarity, of being recognized, and nothing else. What does flesh mean? And what is water? And what is spirit? People may think they at least understand what flesh means, and that dying to the flesh or overcoming the flesh means to subject the body to some discipline, or to starve it, or to give up all physical pleasures. This is probably what is most usually understood by going against the flesh. Certainly many people understand it in this way, and think of anchorites, hermits, and saints merely as people who have made this their main aim, hoping to reach some higher level, some higher development of themselves by such means. Nothing more absurd could be imagined, for no one, starting only from this external viewpoint, can ever reach anything or has ever reached anything. Such people have not grasped the meaning of a phrase used by Christ in another place, when he speaks of those who wish to follow his teaching. He says that in order to follow him, that is, his teaching, the teaching of rebirth, a man must deny himself. But people usually fancy this means to deny themselves of something external, of comforts, of perhaps something that they are especially fond of. They do not grasp that for a man to deny himself, he must deny himself. In the passage in which Christ utters these words, Matthew chapter 16 verse 24, the literal Greek means that a man must utterly deny himself. And it is obvious that if a man is capable of a further development that is latent in him, and so of reaching a higher level of himself, he cannot remain the same man, the same himself, and yet undergo this inner change. For to change internally, to change oneself, does not mean to add something on to what one is already, as a man adds something to his knowledge by taking up a new subject. The idea of transformation has nothing to do with addition. The Greek word metamorphosis, used by Matthew, translated as transfiguration, chapter 17 verse 2, and by Paul in the passage where he says, "Be not fashioned according to the world, but be ye transformed by the entire renewal of your minds," Romans chapter 12 verse 2, means an entire transformation of mind. In the experiments nature has made in the field of insect transformation, the metamorphosis of a grub into a butterfly is not a new addition to the grub as the addition of wings, but a transformation. Change in the sense of mere growth and decay, or increase and decrease, exists everywhere in the universe. But there also exists everywhere another order of change, the phenomenon of transformation. All chemistry is transformation, and so in a sense miraculous. The fire burning in the hearth is transformation. The development of a chicken within an egg is transformation. The growth of a human being from a cell is transformation. The transformation of a cell into a man, or of a grub into a butterfly, belongs to nature, whereas the transformation spoken of by Christ does not belong to nature. All that we have discovered about nature and this form of evolution and transformation belongs to a quite different order from what is spoken of in the Gospels and in many other writings more ancient than they are. It is not astonishing to think that since nature brings about transformation by its own slow and gradual processes, there is also in the life of the mind, feeling and consciousness, a process of a similar kind whose object is to bring about a further transformation. The fact that transformation is found in the external world, in the phenomenal world, in the natural world, inevitably suggests that there is also transformation in the psychological, the mental, the emotional world, the world that everyone really lives in. It is this transformation of which Christ speaks to Nicodemus. This transformation or rebirth, if we try to understand what is possible concerning it, depends on a man's no longer being in or of the flesh. He is as he is of flesh and water. He can become of water and spirit. That means that one connecting element or one principle or factor remains in this transformation, namely water. All these terms are clearly technical terms, that is, they belong to a special language understood by those who are in close touch with Christ. But if we consider the significance of the term metanoia, we will be able to grasp that the flesh refers to the mind of the flesh, a term actually used in the New Testament, and that Nicodemus represented, by his literal attitude, the mind of the flesh, that is, the mind based on the external senses, turned outwards to life or fashioned according to the world. Something far more subtle than mere vanity and worldliness is meant here. The deeper meaning does not lie in such considerations. The mind fed only upon the flesh, upon the food supplied by the senses, cannot make contact with the spirit. The first thing we must notice is that if a man must deny himself, that is, all the ideas he has of himself, all the forms of imagination he has of himself, and all the illusions about himself that make him think he is what he supposes, then the flesh cannot help him to change. For no one can see into himself with the sense organs provided for contact with the external world, and no one can even begin to see himself by external observation. The mind based on the senses cannot bring him to the right place from which to start, and so he will be like Nicodemus, who starts outside himself and is corrected by Christ, who tells him that the whole point is that a man can be reborn, and so must begin from within, in other words from himself, and not from observed miracles or deductions about God from the outer evidence of the senses. Part 4. The Woman of Samaria. What is meant by the word water? In the phrase, "Except a man be born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of heaven," the word obviously has a special meaning and belongs to a language of words used in a particular way. Nothing is said in the conversation between Nicodemus and Christ to show what it means, but it is used in other passages in the New Testament in a special way, as for example in the conversation between Christ and the woman of Samaria, who had come to draw water at Jacob's well. In this conversation, which resembles in some points the conversation with Nicodemus, there is an obvious play of meaning on the word water. The passage is given in Weymouth's translation as follows: Jesus, tired out with his journey, sat down by the well to rest. It was about noon. Presently there came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus asked her to give him some water, for his disciples were gone to the town to buy provisions. "How is it," replied the woman, "that a Jew like you asks me, who am a Samaritan woman, for water?" For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. "If you had known God's free gift," replied Jesus, "and who it is that said to you, 'Give me some water,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," she said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep, so where can you get the living water from? Are you greater than our forefather Jacob, who gave us the well, and himself drank from it, as did also his sons and his cattle?" "Everyone," replied Jesus, "who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water that I shall give him will never, never thirst. The water that I shall give him will become a fountain within him of water springing up for eternal life." "Sir," said the woman, "give me that water, that I may never be thirsty, nor continually be coming all the way here to draw water." "Go and call your husband," said Jesus, "and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. "You rightly say that you have no husband," said Jesus, "for you have had 5 husbands, and the man you have at present is not your husband. You have spoken the truth in saying that." "Sir," replied the woman, "I see that you are a prophet." John chapter 4 verses 6 to 19. In the verses quoted above, the conversation seems to fall into 2 parts that are not connected, or, if they are, the connection is not obvious. This first part ends with the woman's asking for the wonderful water which Christ has spoken of. But as in the case of Nicodemus, who took the idea of rebirth literally, something also appears to be taken here in a literal sense. And just after this, the second part begins. Christ abruptly tells the woman to fetch her husband. Why does he do this? What possible connection has this with the first part? It seems strange that Christ, after speaking of eternal life and the living water that can give it, that is, after speaking on the highest possible scale of meaning, should descend to the commonplace level of moral criticism and apparently accuse a woman who happened to draw water at the well of not being married and of having had 5 husbands. But if the theme is marriage, in the sense of the union of 2 things that give rise to a birth of something new, all birth being the result of the union of 2 things, a connection is found that does away with the feeling of bathos which arises when the passage is taken on the literal level of meaning. For it is then possible to see that the second part directly follows on from the first part, and brings into a narrower focus the situation of man in regard to the ideas of Christ's teaching, and to the ideas he derives from the world outside him from the evidence of his senses. Let us attempt to find the connection, avoiding the literal or sensory meaning. Christ has told the woman that she has had 5 husbands, and added, "He whom thou now hast is not thy husband." What is the idea? The idea is that of some wrong union. This follows immediately on the idea of a wrong understanding, for Christ has just spoken to her of living water, and told her that anyone who drinks of the water that she is drawing will thirst again, but anyone who drinks the water he can give will never thirst. And she has taken this in some literal way, as her answer shows. "Sir," she said, "give me that water, that I may never be thirsty, nor continually be coming all the way here to draw water." Her answer shows that there is some wrong understanding, because the idea from which Christ is speaking escapes her, and she answers from her own idea, which is a different idea, just as Nicodemus answered Christ from his own idea. A person can only think from the ideas his mind is furnished with, and if another person speaks from ideas that he does not possess, he can only misunderstand him, or, if he tries to understand him wrongly. Both Nicodemus and the woman of Samaria represent, at the lowest level of sensual meaning, actual people, and any parable about them will include in it elements that belong to this literal aspect. But they also represent certain states of mind or levels of thought and understanding, and so begin to pass from the physical level of actual external visible people into a subtle psychological level, for any typical state of mind or stage of understanding reached by people in the course of their experience of life is something psychological or internal and quite distinct from any other appearance, that is, quite distinct from what we behold of them as external objects, rendered through our 5 senses. But a parable in the Gospels always begins from the purely sensual level, and the ideas belonging to it, and so taken as such, it seems merely to be what it appears to be, that is, a story about a king, or a vineyard, or a person called Nicodemus, or a Samaritan woman who comes to a literal well in order to draw literal water. In other words, a parable always starts from the first level of meaning that a man acquires from his contact with life, the level of sensual meaning and the ideas belonging to it, which enable a man to live in the world and deal with it according to his natural intelligence. The teaching of Christ is on a different level of meaning, one that refers to the acquiring of quite new ideas and aims and new interpretations of life, in the light of a possible individual evolution of man, contained within him as a possibility, but not fulfilled by the action of life or by any mere adaptation to the external world of life and its changing events, passing in time from moment to moment. Christ speaks of another level of man, of another and new state of his mind, and of a new integration or stage of understanding, and this new level was nearly always connected, not with time, but with the word eternal, which we shall speak about later on. But for a man to pass beyond himself, and so beyond the existing ideas he lives by, that is, For him first of all to undergo metanoia, or change of mind, it is necessary for him to find the ideas and forms of truth that will lead in this direction. For if there be potentially in every man a higher state of himself awaiting his own entry into it, there must also be a definite science, a definite knowledge and practice relating to the attainment of this state, just as, if a man wishes to learn something such as mathematics, it is necessary for him to find definite knowledge and right ideas and forms of truth that actually relate to this possibility. For the possibility of acquiring knowledge will not be realized if a man has union with the wrong ideas, or goes to the wrong teacher, or in this case to a man who does not even understand mathematics himself. It will then be nothing but a case of the blind leading the blind. And Christ at the least represents a man who has reached a higher level of man, and all his teaching is about what it is necessary to think and not to think, to do and not to do, for a man to reach this higher level and attain this inner development and undergo this inherently possible individual evolution without which, as he said, all men equally perish. And this, it must be repeated, is not the ordinary idea people have of the meaning of religion. Many commentators on the New Testament from the earliest times have thought that the woman of Samaria represented a man's soul. What is a man's soul? It is the concentration of his interests, his desires, his impulses, and all these represent where he believes what is best and what is most true lie. A man strives always towards all he thinks is most true and real and good and desirable. A man's soul is his most secret and his deepest love, his most imperious side, his most energizing force. A miser's soul is his avarice. He sees literal gold as the end of life. An ambitious man sees the end of life in getting to the highest position, or gaining the greatest outward power, or the largest possessions. A vain person desires the greatest adulation and praise from external life. Or a man loves comfort, eating, drinking, and more deeply, everyone's love of himself is his soul. Soul is the greatest meaning in the man as he actually is. The woman of Samaria as the soul in a man is represented as having had 5 husbands, that is, it has been wedded to all the 5 senses in its search for what it believes is best and most true, and now is living with a man who is not her husband. What can this mean? It can only mean a state of the soul when the contact with the external world through the 5 channels of sense no longer claims the same hold or excites the same fascination. At this point the soul vaguely turns to other interests, perhaps to some sort of philosophy, or to different forms of so-called occultism, to opinions, theories, and imagination, and so on, in an endeavour to satisfy its thirst with truth other than the truth of the senses. In the narration before us, which can only be a parable and not a mere narration of an actual incident, the soul, thirsting for water, in this state meets with Christ. Christ says that what it is living with is not its husband. The truth it is following does not really belong to it, and so is like a false union. Now it is possible to see why Christ has previously spoken of living water. He has been speaking of a form of truth that can satisfy the searching soul, and this means an order of truth that can lead to a man's attaining inner growth and development once he makes union with it by acknowledging it and living it. The whole parable is about truth. If the use of the word water is studied in this parable, it can be seen that it really has 4 meanings, one lying behind and beyond the other, as does all meanings in parables. First, on the most external sensual level, it is simply literal water, and this level forms the framework. Second, it is water as denoting truth of a certain kind, as the truth connected with the 5 senses, and this truth is, on its own level, real, because the term marriage is applied to it. Third, it is opinion, theory, mere imagination, which is not called a marriage, but a false relation, and so can lead nowhere. And finally, it means that order of truth and those ideas and practices that stir a person inwardly into a state of being alive and form a living spring in him of fresh meanings, so that he never thirsts. All this play of meaning cannot be rendered in any words, because one meaning passes into another and again into a third. But that the meaning of water is truth can easily be proved by quoting a phrase in the third part of the parable, which is given as follows in Weymouth's translation. Christ says, "A time is coming, indeed has already come, when true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for indeed the Father desires such worshippers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." Part 5. In his conversation with Christ, Pilate asked the question, "What is truth?" The incident is given in the authorized version as follows. Then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again, and called Jesus, and said unto him, "Art thou the King of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "Sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it thee of me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Thine own nation and the chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence." Pilate therefore said unto him, "Art thou a king then?" And Jesus answered, "Thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Every one that is of the truth heareth my voice." Pilate saith unto him, "What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went out again unto the Jews, and saith unto them, "I find in him no fault at all." John chapter 18 verses 33 to 38. Pilate does not wait for an answer to his question about truth. In this picture of him by John, he is drawn as going straight out to the multitude. But this action, as well as everything else said about him throughout the trial of Christ, gives one answer to his question about the truth. For the narrative throws into clear relief the type of man to which Pilate belongs, and shows what truth means to this type of man. Pilate is at first sight an enigmatical figure, but he is actually a man for whom truth is a question of policy, and however well educated, however enlightened and humane such a man may be, he will always act at the critical moment in the same way. However he may think and feel privately, he will avoid all personal responsibility, all independent judgment, and follow the multitude. Christ says to Pilate, "Every one that is of the truth heareth my voice." Pilate says, "What is truth?" and goes straight out to the multitude, which is his truth. And although he knows Christ is guilty of no crime and says so, he does not follow his own knowledge. The voice of the multitude decides his policy, and this for him is the right thing to do, and this for him is truth. For whatever a man feels it is right to do is for him truth. Although everyone has a different idea of truth, whatever a man calls truth, it is that which seems right to him and what he does. For Nicodemus, truth was a matter of the senses. He begins to believe in Christ from the evidence of miracles he has seen with his own eyes, and he is told by Christ in so many words that this is a wrong and useless starting point. For Pilate, truth was a matter of calculation, caution, and compromise, but at the same time he knows better. He is afraid to act from what he knows and feels. So in the account given in Matthew chapter 27 verse 24, it is said that fearing a tumult, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person, see ye to it." And this is Pilate throughout the ages. In the apocryphal gospel entitled the Gospel of Nicodemus or Acts of Pilate, the efforts of Pilate to liberate Christ are more emphatically portrayed. But an incident is narrated where Pilate, speaking privately to Christ, asks, "What shall I do with thee?" Jesus answers, "Do as it hath been given thee." Pilate asks, "How hath it been given?" And Jesus replies, "The prophets foretold concerning my death and resurrection." He had to die, and so Pilate had to condemn him to death. This extraordinary passage means that Christ practically told Pilate to put him to death, and, however unwilling Pilate was to do so, he was helped by what Christ said to him privately to act as he did. And this passage, apart from many other reasons, has given effect to the deeper view that the whole drama of Christ was deliberately and consciously acted for a definite reason. And in this connection, anyone can see for himself in the account given by John that while Pilate was anxious to free Christ, yet Christ had warned his disciples continually of his predestined death. And in view of such new thoughts, the whole of the gospel drama changes its entire import and significance, so that it is not possible to imagine that Christ was a mere victim of a cruel world, or to take the sentimental view of the fate that he suffered. Christ had to die in fulfillment of the part he was playing, and Pilate, being the kind of man he was, and following the form of truth that affected him most powerfully, eventually acted in the requisite way. In the same apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus and Pilate, there is an addition to the part of the narrative where Pilate asks what truth is. It is as follows: Pilate saith unto him, What is truth? Jesus saith unto him, Truth is of heaven. Pilate saith, Is there not truth upon the earth? Jesus saith unto Pilate, Thou seest how that they which speak the truth are judged of them that have authority upon earth.